For centuries, the map of the world held a hollow space where a nation once breathed, leaving behind nothing but the dry, whistling wind of memory. The weight of exile is a heavy shroud, one that had draped itself over a people scattered to the four corners of the earth, far from the soil that had birthed their ancestors. In the bustling cities of the West and the quiet villages of the East, the story of the homeland had become a ghost story, a fading echo of a promise that seemed increasingly like a cruel myth. To most of the world, the land was a carcass, a stretch of earth that history had finished with, left to bleach under a merciless sun until the very idea of return felt like a pursuit of shadows. In the heart of this diaspora stood Ilara, an elder whose presence was as gnarled and enduring as an ancient olive root. She was the keeper of stories, the silent sentinel of a heritage that many had deemed obsolete. In her small, cramped quarters, she meticulously safeguarded a collection of ancient parchments, their edges brittle and their ink fading into the yellowed vellum. These were not mere records. They were the lineage of her scattered people and the blueprints of a destiny that refused to die. Ilara spent her nights under the dim glow of a lamp, tracing the lines of forgotten prophecies that spoke of a day when the parched earth would drink again and the weary would find their way home. The land itself, however, told a different story. To any objective eye, the ancestral inheritance was a barren wasteland. It was a stark, jagged landscape of limestone and dust, neglected for nearly 2 millennia. The soil was salty and stubborn, the hillsides stripped of their forests, and the valleys choked with malaria-ridden marshes or bone-dry riverbeds. It was a place that seemed inherently hostile to life, defying any logical hope of revival. For generations, the harsh reality of the present had eroded the belief of the many. In the face of systemic persecution and the grinding gears of modern history, the ancient prophecies were often dismissed as folklore, pretty lies told to children, to offer false comfort in a world defined by the cold walls of exile. Even Ilara, despite her reverence for the scrolls, felt the crushing weight of this despair. She would often read a specific prophecy, detailing a miraculous return to life and the gathering of the scattered from the ends of the earth. But as she looked at the photos of the grey, rocky terrain, her faith flickered like a dying candle. Her nephew, David, represented the sharp edge of this modern doubt. A man of brilliant intellect and pragmatic resolve, David lived by the laws of logic and the tangible results of science. To him, the ancient texts were poetic but ultimately useless relics. He saw only the insurmountable obstacles, the geopolitical tensions, the ecological death of the region, and the sheer impossibility of sustaining a population on a rock. "We cannot eat poems, Aunt Ilara," he would say, his voice tinged with a weary kindness. He prioritized the survival of the here and now over the ghosts of the past. Yet, a deep-seated longing for identity began to pulse like a heartbeat through a small, determined group of the scattered. Against all reason, moved by an ancestral pull they couldn't quite name, they prepared for a perilous journey back. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Their arrival, however, was a baptism of dust. The reality was bleaker than any map could convey. The land sat in a mocking silence, more barren than imagined. While the others saw only a graveyard of stones, Ilara stood on a ridge, her eyes closed, sensing a whisper of life beneath the surface. Re-examining her scrolls with trembling hands, she discovered a subtle, hidden detail, a forgotten condition for the rebirth that required something far beyond conventional farming. The harsh reality of pioneering hit the first wave of settlers like a physical blow. They had arrived with hearts full of ancient songs, but they were greeted by the brutal, unyielding indifference of the wilderness. The sun was a relentless tyrant, baking the limestone until the air shimmered with heat, and the water they had hoped to find in the ancient cisterns was nothing but brackish mud. Relentless droughts turned their modest gardens into brittle skeletons within weeks. The soil was not merely dry, it was infertile, poisoned by centuries of neglect and salt. Disease, too, became a constant companion, as the stagnant water in the lower valleys bred fevers that thinned their ranks. They were alone in a silent, jagged world, and the crushing isolation of the wilderness began to weigh more heavily than the exile they had fled. Adding to the physical toll was the rising tide of external hostility. Neighboring communities and distant political powers watched the returning settlers with eyes narrowed by deep suspicion. To them, these people were interlopers, trespassers on a land that had long ago forgotten them. This suspicion soon curdled into open aggression. Settlers awoke to find their meager irrigation lines slashed and their precious saplings uprooted in the dead of night. Calculated acts of sabotage became a weekly occurrence, and the threats shouted from the ridges grew louder and more frequent. The nascent effort to rebuild was being squeezed between a landscape that refused to give life and neighbors who were determined to see them fail. Predictably, the unrelenting hardships bred a corrosive despair within the camp. Internal discord began to fray the bonds of the community. At night, around dying fires, trust dissolved into accusations. Why had they come? Who had led them to this graveyard? The settlers, once united by a dream, now fought over the last scraps of dried grain. David watched as disillusioned families packed their few belongings and slipped away into the night, preferring the certainty of the diaspora to the slow starvation of the homeland. It was a painful defection that left the remaining group smaller, weaker, and more vulnerable than ever before. Throughout this storm, Ilara remained the spiritual bedrock. While the younger men paced with fury and the women wept over empty pots, she sat among them like a rooted tree. Her ancient wisdom and unwavering faith in the prophecy served as a fragile anchor against the rising tide of defeatism. She did not offer empty platitudes. Instead, she spoke of the land as a living being that was testing their resolve. David, witnessing the raw courage of his aunt and the profound suffering of his people, felt his purely logical view begin to shift. The scientist in him still saw failure, but the man was slowly being drawn into the emotional heart of this impossible struggle. He saw that logic alone could not explain why these people stayed, and he began to wonder if there was a variable he had missed. The focus narrowed to a desperate daily battle for survival. Men spent 18 hours a day digging into the flinty earth, their hands bleeding as they searched for the hidden veins of water Ilara insisted were there. They planted crops in the shadows of the rocks to hide them from the sun, only to see them wither from a lack of nutrients. Starvation loomed over every family, a silent predator waiting for the first one to stumble. Yet, through sheer, agonizing perseverance and innovative, unconventional irrigation methods David devised in his desperation, a small, insignificant patch of ground yielded a harvest. It was just a few handfuls of grain and a dozen stunted vegetables, but it was a potent symbol. It was proof that the land could be bargained with. Just as this flicker of hope began to bloom, catastrophe struck. A devastating, unprecedented drought descended, accompanied by a widespread blight that turned their tiny green victory into a blackened rot within 48 hours. It was a blow that pushed the community to the absolute brink of extinction. In their darkest hour, David sat with Ilara's ancient texts, no longer looking for poetry, but for answers. In the flickering candlelight, he uncovered a detailed, cryptic blueprint within the scrolls. It described precise, forgotten techniques for mineral restoration and the location of deep aquifer access, the forgotten condition Ilara had sensed. This discovery offered a desperate, last-gasp chance, but its implementation demanded a monumental effort of communal unity that seemed impossible. The race against annihilation had begun, even as external forces circled the perimeter, poised to crush their dream forever. The flickering candlelight in the hand of David did more than illuminate the ancient parchment. It lit a fire in his soul that logic could no longer extinguish. Facing those who remained, whose faces were hollowed by hunger and etched with the bitter lines of defeat, David did not speak of probabilities. Instead, he spoke of the blueprint. He told them that the land was not dead, but merely sleeping, waiting for a people who were willing to bleed for its awakening. In that moment of utter desperation, the internal fractures that had threatened to tear the community apart vanished. There were no longer skeptics or believers, only a single, unified body of people bound by a shared destiny. Under the leadership of David and the spiritual guidance of Ilara, they committed to the monumental endeavor of the ancient blueprint. They worked as if possessed. Men, women, and even the older children spent their days and nights digging deep and ancient wells into the sun-scorched limestone. guided by the cryptic markings David had decoded. They labored with their bare hands when tools broke, rerouting forgotten subterranean springs that had been buried for 2,000 years. They terraformed the barren hillsides, creating stone terraces to catch the rare dew. They planted resilient, forgotten species of seeds that Elara had guarded like jewels, seeds that had remained dormant for centuries, awaiting this specific touch. It was a gargantuan battle against the laws of nature, a collective effort that defied every modern metric of success or agricultural science. As the first trickles of water began to dampen the parched earth, the burgeoning life did not go unnoticed. External adversaries, sensing the shift, increased their aggression. Shadows moved along the perimeter at night, and the sound of shouting and occasional gunfire shattered the silence of the desert. The tension escalated into a climactic confrontation, where the settlers found themselves surrounded. Yet instead of retreating, they stood their ground with a resolve that was not born of iron, but of the very soil they had tilled. The ingenuity of David was now used to defend their progress, creating defensive measures that utilized the terrain itself to turn back those who sought their destruction. Amidst this chaos, the strength of Elara finally began to fail. She was weakened by the years of struggle, yet her presence radiated a profound and unsettling peace. As the first green shoots broke through the hard crust of the valley, she watched with tears in her eyes. At the end, she called David to her side, her voice a thin but steady thread. She told him that the prophecy was not about the land alone, but about the transformation of the people who held it. With a final symbolic gesture, she passed the ancient scrolls to him, entrusting the future of their people to the man who had once been their greatest skeptic. She passed away just as the first true rains in decades began to fall, her lifelong work finally complete. David, transformed by loss and discovery, led with a conviction that united ancient wisdom with practical innovation. The scientist and the leader became one. Then, the impossible happened. A once barren hillside suddenly burst into a vibrant and impossible bloom. Thousands of wildflowers carpeted the slopes. It was a shocking, undeniable manifestation that triggered a wave of overwhelming emotion. People fell to their knees, weeping and laughing, as the desert literally began to blossom like a rose. This miracle was only the beginning. The renewal spread quickly like a wildfire across the territory. Ancient rivers that had been dry for millennia began to flow freely, and the soil became fertile and rich. News of this restoration spread across the globe, reaching the kin scattered across the earth. Thousands of people began to return, fulfilling the ancient promise of gathering from the ends of the earth. The land was no longer a graveyard, it was a home. The nation was reborn through a destiny realized, standing as a living testament to a restoration that the world had deemed impossible. The ancient promise was kept,